The Confederate statue known as Silent Sam to a new $5 million campus building. On Monday, UNC Chapel Hill student and activist Maya Little was charged with 2 misdemeanors, inciting a riot and assaulting an officer after a campus protest. Earlier this year, Maya Little poured her own blood and red paint on the statue. To see our interview with Little, go to our website at democracynow.org. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world. We begin today's show in Wisconsin, where Republican lawmakers are orchestrating an unprecedented power grab to weaken incoming Democratic Governor Tony Evers before he takes office. In an extraordinary move that some are calling a legislative coup, Republican legislators have worked throughout the night to pass a sweeping package of lame duck bills to give power to the Republican-controlled legislature before Republican Governor Scott Walker leaves office in January. Republicans in both houses worked throughout the early morning to gather enough votes to pass the bills. Both houses are still in session now. At 7 a.m. Eastern Time, the Associated Press reported that the Wisconsin Senate passed a measure to limit the power of the Democratic governor and attorney general-elect and restrict early voting periods. Earlier Wednesday morning, the Senate and Assembly passed a bill enacting a Medicaid work requirement and limiting the incoming governor's ability to change state laws that require able-bodied adults without children to work in order to receive public benefits. On Tuesday, protesters took to the state capitol in Madison for a second day to oppose the power grab.
The legislature is also considering measures to move up the 2020 presidential primary election to help a far-right judge remain on the state Supreme Court and allow the legislature to sidestep Wisconsin's incoming Democratic Attorney General in certain legal battles. This is Democratic State Representative Chris Taylor speaking Monday.
Ever in the history of the state of Wisconsin has there been an extraordinary session convened to take away the powers of a newly elected governor and a newly elected attorney general.
Republican lawmakers are making a similar push for power with lame duck bills in Michigan. These actions are in part modeled after a Republican power grab in North Carolina 2 years ago, when the Republican-controlled legislature weakened the incoming Democratic Governor Roy Cooper's ability to appoint cabinet members, among other actions. Well, for more, we're going to Madison, Wisconsin. We're joined by Ruth Conniff, editor-at-large of the Progressive magazine, which is based there. Her most recent piece headlined, "Wisconsin Republicans Make Unprecedented Power Grab, the People Push Back." Ruth, welcome to Democracy Now! I assume you've been up all night, at least the legislators have. What is happening in the Wisconsin legislature?
Well, what's happening in the Wisconsin legislature continues to unfold. But as of 4 o'clock this morning, the legislature had managed to pass the first of this raft of bills to grab power from the incoming governor, Tony Evers, before he takes office. And the bill that is going to go to Scott Walker's desk next is the bill that insists on work requirements for Medicaid recipients and, more broadly, gives the legislature power to review all federal waivers that the governor might want to seek to get out of, that Scott Walker sought. So that's very significant because it's putting the legislature in charge of everything related to health care that might involve a federal waiver. And that's a whole large, broad array of possible acts that the governor might want to take. The background, though, I think what's really important to understand is that here in Wisconsin in 2018, Democrats won every single statewide race. And our legislature is still Republican-dominated because it is the most gerrymandered set of districts legislatively in the United States of America. It's been the subject of a federal lawsuit. A federal judge found it to be unconstitutional, the map that was drawn in secret to lock Republicans into power in the state legislature. It went all the way to the Supreme Court and was turned back on a technicality. The Supreme Court found that the plaintiff in the case didn't have standing. So this is going to continue to be litigated. Because of their gerrymandered districts, the Republicans have held on to power in our state legislature legislature, even as they've lost power in every statewide office. So they have called this extraordinary lame duck session in order to ram through a series of measures that basically decapitate the executive branch and give the legislature itself power over an enormous number of things, whether it's agencies, whether it's making the attorney general come to the legislature and specifically to a committee, with a Republican-dominated committee within the legislature to get permission to pursue lawsuits, whether it's settlement money potentially in lawsuits. That's all controlled by the legislature now. And then limiting early voting, which is very significant because Wisconsin had record turnout in 2018. And because of early voting, which the legislature had tried to cut off, and then a federal judge intervened and said, no, it's unconstitutional, there were enormous numbers of Wisconsin citizens who voted early. And the legislature is now, and both houses have passed this. They need to get together on it, but they have limited early voting to 2 weeks. So instead of 6 weeks, as it was here in Dane County, where we had presidential level turnout, they're going to have 2 weeks. And again, it's just an effort to suppress the will of the people and to concentrate power in the state legislature.
Well, Ruth, in terms of the limits on the governor's appointment powers, could you get go into some of the specifics of what is actually happening with some of these agencies? Some of them, they're actually packing with more members that the legislature would have say over?
Yes. So, for example, the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation, which has replaced the Commerce Department under Governor Scott Walker, it's a scandal-plagued agency that hands out gifts to corporations that promise to create jobs. The legislature has taken away the governor's power to appoint the head of that agency. They're still working this out. It still needs to be signed by Scott Walker, but this is where they're going. And there was debate on it as I walked into the studio. They plan to pack the board so that until September, and this is a recent redo, this is as of 4 o'clock this morning, they plan to pack the board with Republican-chosen members so that the governor can't appoint the head of the board anymore, and the Republican legislature controls the makeup of the board. After September, they say it will be balanced. They'll be chosen by legislators from the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. But what they are fundamentally doing is undoing Tony Evers' campaign promise to get rid of this agency altogether, because it has handed out tens of millions of dollars in taxpayer money to corporations that have failed to create jobs.
Including,
one of the smaller
one of those corporations was Foxconn as well.
Foxconn, which is it's a big company that our state has given an enormous amount of subsidy money to, and really was a major issue in the campaign because it's a gigantic subsidy for this corporation that is not creating a lot of jobs and hiring people actually from Illinois to make big flat screens that will probably be obsolete shortly. There are a number of corporations that have received tens of millions of dollars from the state of Wisconsin. In this bill that the legislature is pushing through right now, they remove the requirement that those corporations even demonstrate that they're creating jobs. That was a requirement that they were failing to meet, and it's the reason that the public is so up in arms against this Wisconsin Economic Development Board. It's going to continue to exist. The Republicans are going to pack the board, and now they're going to take away the requirement that the corporations they give money to, taxpayer money to, even show that they're doing anything in exchange for that money.
But Foxconn will be the reason why the governor of Wisconsin, Scott Walker, lost. I mean, the touting of Foxconn coming to Wisconsin and then people recognizing how much it would actually cost them. And Ruth, before we go on, for people who aren't familiar with Wisconsin politics, I mean, we were there in 2011, the massive protests that were held on the Capitol grounds against Scott Walker going after the public unions, the significance of what Walker is doing in just having been defeated in his race.
Yes, it is really a replay of 2011 when we saw those historic protests. What is happening is, similarly, the public is shocked to find out that our legislature in the middle of the night is ramming through a series of anti-democratic measures. A lot of people have come out to the Capitol. There were more than 1,300 members of the public who, when they found out late on Friday afternoon that this series of bills was going to be pushed through in this extraordinary lame duck session to limit the powers of the governor and attorney general before they could even take office, turned out at the Capitol, registered against the bills. They all all of the people who came out, all 1,348 registered against the bill, except for one. There was one person in favor, testified all night long in dramatic hearings. And then when they were locked out of the chamber by Republicans who wanted to keep the public out, were pounding on the doors and chanting. There was a huge rally outside the Capitol. It was very reminiscent of 2011. And the same thing is at stake here. It is really a cabal of people in our state legislature trying to seize power and consolidate power for themselves and override basic democratic processes. In 2011, they ignored the open meetings law and they rammed through legislation without giving Democrats time to consider it. And now what's going on is very similar. 80 appointments. Governor Scott Walker has made 80 appointments in this extraordinary session since Monday without any public hearings and without any disclosure of their financial interests. So he is packing the University of Wisconsin Board of Regents. He is packing the Public Service Commission. He is packing the Wisconsin Economic Development Board with his friends and cronies before the new governor can come in. And this is expressly against what was discussed in the campaign. The people of Wisconsin elected a Democratic governor who was very clear he was going to eliminate that Economic Development Board and he was going to expand access to health care. That one of the things the legislature has done is to make sure that the new Attorney General does not have the power to withdraw Wisconsin from a federal lawsuit that opposes the Affordable Care Act. So there's just a huge effort here to prevent the will of the people from being enacted by this new administration.
And Ruth, what's happening in Wisconsin is not just happening there. In Michigan, Republican state legislators have also introduced several bills designed to clip the powers of the governor, attorney general, and secretary of state after Democrats took all three offices in the midterm elections. One bill would allow the state legislature to get involved in any state legal proceedings, which historically fell to the governor and the state attorney general. So it seems that if Wisconsin succeeds, there are going to be other states following in its footsteps.
And even in addition to that, I would add that it is a national strategy. What we're seeing in Wisconsin and Michigan is a national strategy by Republicans who are losing their hold on power after the 2018 elections. They see a wave that is trying to push back Republicans, and the response to that is to try to undo democracy. It's to try to limit voting. It's to try to very specifically bring in private attorneys, and this is happening both in Wisconsin and in Michigan, bring in private attorneys to replace the attorney general who represents the public. And in Wisconsin, this is an issue, and in Michigan, this is an issue because they're going to bring these private attorneys into court to represent the legislature, which is Republican dominated, instead of allowing the executive and the attorney general, who are Democrats, to pursue those lawsuits as they always have, to make decisions about which lawsuits to pursue and to show up in court. And just now in the Wisconsin legislature, there was a Republican senator standing up and saying they ought to be able to hear from both sides. A judge ought to be able to sit there and see the attorney general representing the state of Wisconsin and a private attorney representing the Republicans in the legislature arguing against the state's position right there in the same courtroom, which is chaotic. You have one side that's represented by two opposing points of view. So this is, I believe, very clearly a national strategy.
In Michigan, it's also interesting just to note that all three leaders, incoming Democratic leaders in Michigan, are women, which is a first for Michigan. You have Gretchen Whitmer, the governor-elect. You have Jocelyn Benson, the Secretary of State, and Dana Nessel, the Attorney General. One of the first times, I think, in the country anywhere that the top three leaders of a state are going to be women.
All women, all won by big, healthy margins, and all are pushing back against the same agenda we've seen in Wisconsin, which is the disempowerment of unions and the interests of the wealthy represented by a Republican legislature that is pushing through major tax cuts for corporations and very wealthy individuals, also part of the package in Wisconsin that we're seeing right now, and that is trying to subvert public education, pouring public money into private schools. That's a major issue both in Michigan Michigan and Wisconsin. So undoing the public sphere, concentrating power, and cutting taxes for the wealthy. And you see the public's response looking at what's happened over the last 8 years here in Wisconsin. We see our roads crumbling. We see people losing access to health care. We see our schools suffering from massive budget cuts. And the public has really spoken on this. And they've asked to remove Scott Walker from office. They've elected Democrats at every level. And they're ready for a more humane state and a better future. And instead, what we're getting is an enormous number of private attorneys who the Republicans in the legislature now want to hire to represent committees and members of the legislature and legislative staff to do their business in secret, to hold negotiations that could be subject to attorney-client privilege when it comes to lawsuits that are filed against the state or decisions that the Attorney General would want to make but would have to consult with the legislature about lawsuits that he would pursue. So you see this secrecy and a lot of public expenditure on private attorneys in order to concentrate power for these Republicans and their wealthy friends.
Ruth, and in terms of public expenditures, could you talk about the effort to add another primary in 2020, change the date of the presidential primary and what the meaning of that is?
Well, this is the one piece of this package of legislation that did not make it out of committee. So it seems that the Republicans have been shamed into dropping their effort to change the date of Wisconsin's presidential primary. And what's interesting about it is there is a Republican incumbent judge on the state Supreme Court, and we elect our state Supreme Court justices here in Wisconsin. He was appointed by Scott Walker, and he will have to face the public in an election that will come up at the same time that we're holding a presidential primary. So what the Republicans did was to propose moving the election for the state Supreme Court off the date of the presidential primary. So they would hold two elections in very quick succession at enormous expense with potentially overlapping early voting. This is the origin of curtailing early voting to make sure that you can't go and vote for your presidential candidate in the primary and also vote for that state Supreme Court justice. There was so much news about this and so much protest that it never made it out of the Joint Finance Committee. That doesn't mean it won't come up again on the floor. And it's starting to get light outside, so maybe they won't try to include that in their package now. But I think what that shows, first of all, they were willing to spend $7 million over the objections of nearly every single local election official in the state to separate these elections for no reason except to protect a Republican justice from facing a high turnout electorate. And I think what it really shows is that public pressure and really bad national headlines shamed the Republicans into ramping that back. And what we're seeing now is, they have been readjusting these bills as they work through the night. They were still writing bills, rewriting bills, and trying to get their caucuses together at midnight. And at 4 o'clock, they began to bring out new versions of these bills. So for now, it seems like Wisconsin is going to go ahead and have one election in the spring that will include the presidential primary and the Supreme Court race.
And, these are legislators voting. So in the new session, a new set of legislators can vote. Is there any way this could be turned back?
Well, the Republicans... This is what you have to understand about Wisconsin. The Republicans, although they lost overwhelmingly, and they lost every single statewide race in 2018, they held on to power in the legislature. There's been virtually no change in the makeup of both houses of the Wisconsin state legislature. And the reason for that is that although many more Wisconsinites voted Democratic than Republican in 2018, the Republicans actually picked up some seats in the legislature because they have drawn a map in which they have gerrymandered their districts so that they have packed all the Democrats together in one small district, and they have stretched out the Republican districts to include every Republican they can find in their area. And this has been the subject of a federal lawsuit, and the federal judge ruled against Wisconsin, said it was unconstitutional. The Supreme Court on appeal turned it back to the federal court. So this will come up again. And then the big threat for Republicans in Wisconsin is that in 2020, after the census, they're going to have to draw new maps. And those new maps are going to have to pass an executive who is a Democrat. So they will not be able to do what they did in 2010, which is to go into a back room in a law firm that was friendly to Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker, draw secret maps, and then ram them through, only to be found that they were unconstitutional. And And that's where I think all of the things that the Republicans in Wisconsin are doing now will come back to bite them. And just like Republicans across the country, they're facing a demographic wave that's against them. They're facing popular opinion that's against them. And they're doing everything they can to consolidate and hang on to power at the last minute. But ultimately, they will have to face the voters. And so this legislature is not going to change in this session. And they're going to try to run the state and take powers away from the governor. But they are not. It is a bad long-term strategy. And I spoke to many Republicans who came out to the Capitol to say they would never vote Republican again after watching this kind of self-serving behavior. So they're losing their own constituents with these maneuvers.
Ruth Conniff, we want to thank you for being with us, editor-at-large of the Wisconsin-based magazine The Progressive. Her most recent piece we will link to, Wisconsin Republicans Make Unprecedented Power Grab, The People Push Back. When we come back, Rick MacArthur, author of Second Front, Censorship and Propaganda in the Gulf War. We look back at George H.W. Bush's legacy when it comes to the Gulf War. Stay with us. My Child, an Iraqi Lullaby. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, a national day of mourning has been declared following the death of former President George H.W. Bush, who died Friday at the age of 94. The post office and other federal agencies are closed for the day. A funeral service for Bush is being held today at the Washington National Cathedral. Former Presidents Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, Jimmy Carter, and Bush's son, George W. Bush, will attend, as will President Trump, who was not invited to speak. Former Florida Governor Jeb Bush explained why President Trump was not speaking by saying, quote, "It's because we have a unique circumstance here. My brother was president, first dibs," as we used to say. A second funeral will be held on Thursday in Houston, where George H.W. Bush will be buried. Well, we continue now to look back at the legacy of the 41st president. Bush only served one term in the Oval Office, but the blowback from his 1991 invasion of Iraq is still being felt today. Although the Gulf War technically ended in February 1991, the U.S. war on Iraq would continue for decades, first in the form of devastating sanctions, and then in the 2003 invasion launched by George H.W. Bush's son, George W. Bush. Thousands of U.S. troops and contractors remain in Iraq today.
We look back now at a largely forgotten aspect of Bush's war in Iraq, the vast domestic propaganda campaign that occurred in the United States before the invasion began. The story centers on a young Kuwaiti woman named Nayira. On October 10th, 1990, the 15-year-old girl gave riveting testimony before Congress about the horrors inside Kuwait after Iraq invaded.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, my name is Nayira, and I just came out of Kuwait. My sister, with my 5-day-old nephew, traveled across the desert to safety. There was no milk available for the baby in Kuwait. They barely escaped when their car was stuck in the desert sand, and help came from Saudi Arabia. I stayed behind and wanted to do something for my country. The second week after invasion, I volunteered at the Al-Adan hospital with 12 other women who wanted to help as well. I was the youngest volunteer. The other women were from 20 to 30 years old. While I was there, I saw the Iraqi soldiers come into the hospital with guns. They took the babies out of the incubators. Took the incubators and left the children to die on the cold floor. It was horrifying. I could not help but think of my nephew.
Nayira's testimony was rebroadcast across the country and marked a turning point in public opinion on going to war. President George H.W. Bush repeatedly cited her claims.
They had kids in incubators, and they were thrown out of the incubators so that Kuwait could be systematically dismantled.
3 months after Nayira testified, President George H.W. Bush launched the invasion of Iraq. But it turned out Nayira's claims weren't true. No human rights group or news outlet could confirm what she said. It also turned out Nayira was not just any Kuwaiti teenager. She was the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to the United States, Saad Nasir al-Sabah. She had been coached by the public relations firm Hill & Knowlton, which was working for the Kuwaiti government. We're joined now by the journalist who first revealed Nayira's identity, Rick MacArthur, the president and publisher of Harper's Magazine, the author of the book Second Front, Censorship and Propaganda in the 1991 Gulf War. I mean, so, you know, as we said, this is as a turning point. You have this teenager, this girl saying she witnessed this, that Iraqi soldiers came into Kuwait and ripped babies out of Kuwaiti incubators. But she was only referred to as Nayira at the time of the testimony. It wasn't Nayira al-Sabah, so you would know that she's the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador who also testified in that hearing.
Correct. That's all part of the propaganda plan, is to maintain her anonymity, to protect her and her family against reprisals in Kuwait. That was the cover story. But of course, nobody bothered to try to find out who she really was. They just bought the story hook, line, and sinker, even though at the time there were a couple of human rights investigators who were becoming suspicious. I got onto the trail after the war, unfortunately, and was able to run down what really had happened, which was that Hill & Knowlton selected her as a persuasive witness to this atrocity, and it was all part of a campaign to turn Saddam Hussein, at least in the public consciousness, into Adolf Hitler. And the feeling was that they couldn't sell the Gulf War without this. In other words, they had to cheat to win. And that's what interests me about the eulogies for George Bush. He's being presented now as this paragon of kind of WASP respectability and integrity, old school, when in fact he had a violent side to him, a very angry and violent and ruthless side to him. And when you see him doing the propaganda, using the Hill & Knowlton disinformation, you see a side of a politician that's kind of ugly. And we're still, as Juan said, we're still living with the consequences of our having placed troops in Saudi Arabia, because that's what sets off bin Laden, finally.
And Rick, in terms of most people, it's been over a quarter century now. Most people don't recall the climate then, but there was significant public opposition to the United States going into Iraq to beat back the invasion of Kuwait, and the vote to approve the military action was very close, wasn't it? So this was crucial. This testimony.
Precisely. You got to remember, in 1990-91, we're only 15 years after Vietnam, and there's still this very, very bad feeling in the country that's represented in Congress by senators like John Kerry, that we were conned into Vietnam. It was an undeclared war, and we weren't going to get conned again into another phony war or a phony pretext. And so it was clear that Bush was going to have to get congressional authorization for liberating Kuwait. And so the vote was going to be very close. It ended up being 52-47. It would have been 52-48 if Alan Cranston, the senator from California, had come back to Washington to vote. He said he would have voted if it was close. He was undergoing chemotherapy in California. And it's clear that numerous representatives and senators cited the baby incubator atrocity, which was false. It never happened, as a reason for voting for the Gulf War resolution. In other words, these are people who said, well, look, we could figure out other ways to get Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait, economic sanctions, negotiations. There was a feeling that this was about oil. It wasn't about principle, even though Bush posed it as a matter of international law. But these people said, finally, look, if he's really Hitler, if he's really capable of having an army that slaughters, and it got to hundreds of babies by the time Amnesty International gave its official seal of approval to the story.
No, that's
it was inflated.
That's
it got
very,
even bigger.
very important about Amnesty International and the role that it played. It wasn't just Naira.
It wasn't just Naira. Human Rights Watch fell for it. They were neutral officially, but Amnesty International actually put the number over 300 babies. There weren't that many incubators in Kuwait City hospitals. Now, if you want to go back over the record, you'll see how badly the media, how badly the press failed in all this.
Well, I remember my newspaper, the New York Daily News, had a front page. They killed the babies, so the media uncritically accepted this story without any kind of check.
And if he's a baby killer, then, well, reasonable people can disagree about how to enforce international law, how to prevent countries from invading other countries, but we have to draw the line at baby killing. And after the war, it's not just me, it's John Martin who did the really good reporting. He went around to all the hospitals for ABC News and did what a reporter should do, unfortunately too late, interviewed hospital personnel, doctors, did a very thorough job. Nobody could cite one instance of a baby being pulled from an incubator by Iraqi soldiers and killed. There were babies killed because of neglect and because of the American bombardment of Kuwait and of Iraq, because a lot of hospital personnel fled. There were casualties. There were infants who died, but there were no babies killed by being pulled from incubators. It never happened.
And this was, I think, as you know, the beginning of a new effort at increased effort at the propaganda campaigns of our government to justify war.
Right. And this is something that hasn't been explored enough. Again, we go back to George Bush's alleged WASP integrity and respectability. Well, he's also the father of George W. Bush, who took the propaganda campaign a couple of steps further with Saddam's fake atomic bomb program. Never happened. It never existed in the time that we said it was going on. He may have had ambitions before, but there certainly was no atomic bomb program in 2002, 2003. But we've now gotten so used to debating whether we should go to war or not based on fake news. I'm sorry to quote Donald Trump, but false information, that we don't know how to discuss these subjects anymore. And the war-making power has been taken out of the hands of the people, almost been taken out of the hands of the Congress. It's almost quaint. Somebody said to me earlier, why did Bush bother to ask Congress for permission to invade Iraq in 1991? Well, back then we were still a little bit more of a constitutionally ruled country. And there was this bitter memory of the Gulf of Tonkin resolution and Vietnam, and the fact that we fought an undeclared war on false pretexts.
We're talking to Rick MacArthur, publisher of Harper's Magazine, author of Second Front, Censorship and Propaganda in the Gulf War. The beginning of your book, Second Front, Censorship and Propaganda in the 1991 Gulf War, is the first chapter is called Cutting the Deal. And you start with a quote of Earl Shura saying some men are pleased to give orders, some men are pleased to take orders. It's really the beginning of the embedding process.
Right.
And explain this highly unusual meeting, August morning in 1990, 8 days after Iraqi forces invaded Kuwait. Of the four at the time, and you know the media landscape is so different, the four Washington bureau chiefs of the major U.S. television networks presenting themselves where?
Well, they present themselves at the home of Prince Bandar, who is the Saudi fixer in the United States. He's the sort of major domo of everything that happens Saudi-related in the United States. And he's the guy that the reporters have to ask for favors. That's who you go to for help, because the White House and the Pentagon had decided from the beginning we're not going to have another Vietnam. In other words, we're not going to have another situation where reporters are permitted to go anywhere they want, take pictures of corpses, take pictures of burning buildings or helicopters crashing. We're not going to, because the belief was, the revisionist belief was that we lost Vietnam because the American public was demoralized by all the bad news coming back on CBS Evening News and in Newsweek. So we're not going to let this happen again. And the decision was made to pool reporters and to censure them. In other words, you'd send groups of 5 to the front, wherever the Pentagon decided the front happened to be that day. They would get to take pictures and describe things in theory, but their report would have to be shared with everybody else. There'd be no competition, and it would have to be vetted by Pentagon censors. So obviously, the American public saw nothing. The reporters were permitted to see nothing, and it was a kind of comical, finally, to see hundreds of reporters in Dhahran, which is where the press center was, recycling censored reports from the front, which showed nothing. There were 2 or 3 honorable reporters, Chris Hedges, Bob Simon of CBS, who went off the reservation, so to speak, and saw a little bit. But these were the exceptions. Susan Sachs from Newsday was another person who tried to do a good job.
Didn't they go to the Saudi ambassador's home, sent there by the Bush administration, even though the Bush administration was sending soldiers into Saudi Arabia? When it came to the press getting permission, they said, you'll have to get permission from Saudi Arabia.
Well, this was a way to lobby the Saudis for favors. It was still going to be the Pentagon that decided who got to go where when. But the feeling was among the networks was if we can get Prince Bandar to cut us some, give us some, do some favors for us, cut us some slack, maybe he can use his influence with the Bush administration to give us better access than the competition. And this brings us back to the present day. I mean, we're in bed with the Saudi Arabians, going back a long way. And the idea of the American media begging for favors from a Saudi prince, well, it's an ugly image, and it also speaks to the hypocrisy of the American media back then and still today about the First Amendment. I mean, there were a group of us that sued the Pentagon, Sidney Schanberg and The Nation and Harper's Magazine. We sued the Pentagon over this. We lost, and over the censorship plan. But for the most part, Katharine Graham, Sulzberger, the heads of the networks, they didn't do anything. That's all in my book also. You can see what they said about it.
We're talking to Rick MacArthur, publisher of Harper's Magazine, author of Second Front, Censorship and Propaganda in the Gulf War. We'll be back with him in a minute.
What is the question and what is the protest?
Okay, and the corridor.
Since when is skepticism
Combat Rock by Sleater Kinney. And a shout out to today's class visiting Democracy Now! Marymount Manhattan College. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. As we look at President George H.W. Bush's legacy when it comes to war, particularly the Iraq War. Juan?
Well, Rick, I wanted to ask you, following up on what we were talking about the agreement of many of the major media companies to go along with the censorship protocols of the Pentagon in the war. Ironically, this was the first live televised war, and those of us who remember the pictures of the bombers hitting different parts of Iraq and Kuwait. So you had this irony of, on the one hand, there was censorship and control. On the other hand, it was a televised war. So the American people got this idea of these precision-guided bombs that the United States was unleashing on the Iraqi forces.
Right. Strictly speaking, it's not the first televised war. We could say Vietnam is the first televised war.
Live televised.
But live televised war, yes, in the sense that you have these long press conferences, if you can call them that, run by Norman Schwarzkopf, the commander of the overall commander of the Allied forces, as they were quaintly called, who turns out to be a brilliant PR man. And what he understood was it better to talk over the reporters at the press conference and show pictures in real time if possible. Sometimes they were real time, sometimes they were videotapes, to show what the Army was allegedly doing before anybody could check it out. So he brilliantly, it looks very old-fashioned. He's got a television set up on the stage in Dhahran showing allegedly precision-guided precision missiles hitting their targets every time to give people the feeling that the American Army is invincible.
Let's turn to the U.S. military commander in charge of Iraq, who you're referring to, General Norman Schwarzkopf. During a news conference January 31st, 1991, he explains how the U.S. has been targeting Iraq's Scud missiles.
Last night in western Iraq, we also attacked and destroyed 3 Scud tells with F-15s, and I feel we preempted a missile attack on Israel last night. Now, I certainly can't say there will be no more Scud launches. You can never say that. But I have a high degree of confidence that we're getting better and better at our ability to find them, and I think this tape speaks for itself in our ability to find them and destroy them.
That's Norman Schwarzkopf, General Norman Schwarzkopf.
Right. And the day before, actually, they showed pictures of the United States Air Force allegedly blowing up mobile Scud missile launchers, because at that point, people were very upset, frightened that the Iraqis were going to hit targets in Israel. They did get a couple of Scuds through the defenses into Israel. So they had to have results. They had to show that they were taking out the Scud missile launchers. And so they claimed to have knocked out 11 of them. After the war, Scott Ritter and Mark Crispin Miller did some good reporting and refuted this, said that no Scud missile launchers were blown up, but the mobile Scud missile launchers. But the point is that in real time, the press, the media, could not challenge anything that was said. Here's the video. Here are the generals with their pointers. How can you argue with this? And there's nobody on the ground, no reporters in the field who can verify anything or contradict anything. It's not easy, even under the freest circumstances in wartime, to confirm or refute what the government says. But there's zero chance in this war. So the American public gets the impression that it's a clean war, a sanitized war. We're hitting every target. One of the great statistics to know is that 93% of the tons tonnage dropped on Iraq and Kuwait in the Gulf War was conventional dumb bombs, most of them from Vietnam-era B-52s. Only 7% of the tonnage fired were laser-guided missiles, which is what they're talking about here. So
it's possible to say that it was under George Herbert Walker Bush that the United States government perfected the propaganda control of media coverage of the war.
Yes, and none of these things are new. In other words, if you go back to World War I, you've got Belgian babies were being bayoneted by the Germans. I mean, it's an old propaganda trick. So killing babies has been used before, but in terms of actual technical sophistication, using the latest media technology to subvert democracy and to manipulate people and to make them feel good about the war. Ultimately, Schwarzkopf, CENTCOM, Pete Williams at the Pentagon, and the Bush administration. This was the pièce de résistance.
Your final thoughts in the last 30 seconds on the review of President George H.W. Bush's life that we're seeing in the media today.
Well, I'm horrified. There was a column in the Wall Street Journal yesterday by William McGurn, headline George Bush's Wonderful Life, where he literally compares him to George Bailey in It's a Wonderful Life, which is crazy on its face because George Bailey is a kind of populist. He's opposed to the power of Mr. Potter and his bank and so on and so forth. But George Bush was not a peace-loving guy. I'll never forget George McGovern saying to me, and George McGovern,
we have 15 seconds.
McGovern having been a bomber pilot in World War II, saying, most of us came back from World War II. Most of us who came back from World War II had enough. Bush didn't.
Global Community Radio, Channel 1, KAKU-LP, Kahilui, KBOG-LP, Bandon, KFZR-LP, Fraser Park, KIEZ-LP, Monroe, KLQS-LP, Agua Dulce, KPDO, Pescadero, Sunflower State Radio Extra, Marysville, WLRI-LP, Gap, WMUU-LP, Madison, WRAQ-LP, Angelica, WXDR-LP, New Orleans, WXIR-LP, Rochester.
What is the connection between Canadian policy and the exodus of thousands from Honduras? What are some of the changes brought about in Honduran society as a result of the 2009 overthrow of President Manuel Zelaya? What hazards are the Central Americans seeking asylum facing as they make their way toward the U.S.-Mexican border? What difference will a newly elected leftist leader make to the overall Central American migrant crisis as he assumes the presidency of Mexico in December? On this week's Global Research News Hour, on a week following the dramatic events at the U.S.-Mexico border in Tijuana, we take a closer look at the factors influencing and impacting the plight of thousands of Central Americans fleeing difficult circumstances in their home countries. We first hear from Canadian academic and book author Tyler Shipley about the role of Canada in generating and exacerbating the conditions leading to the migrations out of Honduras. Then we hear from an on-the-ground reporter, Jose Luis Granados Ceja, about some of the people on the caravan and about the support, the opposition, and the dangers they've been facing on their 4,000-kilometer journey. On this week's program, the migrant caravan, Canadian and U.S. business interests place profits over people in Central America. Bringing you the analysis beyond the media headlines, the Global Research News Hour is on the air. Welcome to the Global Research News Hour for the week of November 30th, 2018. I'm series host and producer Michael Welch. The Global Research News Hour is a special radio collaboration between the Center for Research on Globalization and campus community radio station CKUW 95.9 FM in Winnipeg on occupied Anishinaabe-Gakin, the homeland of the Métis Nation and the traditional territory of the Nahiawak and the Nakota. We seek to provide you with access to analysis of the major issues shaping our world today from thinkers, researchers, and unique political personalities rarely addressed by major media. Our program is available from the Center's website, globalresearch.ca. We'll begin our show with News Notes, a sampling of articles from the Global Research News site. Predictably, the crisis that began on Sunday between Russia and Ukraine in the Kerch Strait is quickly worsening as Russia has announced plans to deploy more of its advanced S-400 surface-to-air missile systems to Crimea. Adding to tensions, Reuters has further reported that a Russian warship has been dispatched to the Sea of Azov, waters used by both countries and near where the Russian Navy seized Ukrainian vessels and crew for what Moscow condemned as maneuvering dangerously and illegal entry into Russian territory. The warship was seen departing a Crimean port by a Reuters correspondent on Wednesday and was described as the Russian Navy minesweeper ship, the Vice Admiral Zakharin, going in the direction of the Sea of Azov. This comes a day after Ukraine's President Petro Poroshenko issued provocative statements during a televised interview on Tuesday that his country is, quote, under threat of full-scale war with Russia, unquote, while seeking to justify martial law. The Ukrainian president added that, quote, the number of units that have been deployed along our border, what's more, along its full length, has grown dramatically, unquote. That comes from the article, Russia deploys S-400 missiles to Crimea in military showdown with Ukraine, posted November 29th, originally appearing at Zero Hedge. British military personnel have been present in Ukraine since 2015, involved in training Ukraine military personnel. On November 21st, 2018, a few days prior to the Kerch Strait incident, the British Ministry of Defence confirmed that a new contingent of UK Special Forces were slated to be sent to Ukraine. According to Deputy Commander Edward Bassarin, a representative of the Ministry of Defense of the DNR, quote, we've repeatedly said that an act of terror on a chemical enterprise is being prepared, unquote. The UK forces are in Ukraine advising Ukrainian forces. That comes from the article posted under the headline, Video, British Special Forces in Ukraine, Alleged Chemical Weapons and Black Ops Against Donbass, posted November 28th, originally published at Vesti News. Rostislav Ishenko, arguably the sharpest observer of Russia-Ukraine relations, in a piece written before the Kerch incident, said, quote, Ukraine itself recognized the right of Russia to introduce restrictions on the passage of ships and vessels through the Kerch Strait, having obeyed these rules in the summer, unquote. Yet, after the U.S. deep state's massive investment, even before the protests on the Maidan in Kiev in 2014 that wrested Ukraine away from Russian influence, a possible entente cordiale between the Trump administration and the Kremlin, with Russia in control of Crimea and a pro-Russian Donbass, could only be seen as a red line for the Americans. Thus, a Kerch Strait incident designed as a cheap provocation bearing all the hallmarks of a U.S. think tank ploy is automatically interpreted as Russian aggression, regardless of the facts. Indeed, any such tactics are good when it comes to derailing the Trump-Putin meeting at the G20 in Buenos Aires this coming weekend. That comes from the article, Drama in the Kerch Strait, Teasing the Russian Bear, by Pepe Escobar, posted November 28th, originally published at Asia Times. According to The Guardian, Russia's foreign ministry has accused Ukraine of coordinating